Perched on a narrow spit of limestone jutting into the deep blue waters of the Mediterranean, the city of Valletta stands today as one of the most fortified urban spaces ever conceived by human hands. And to walk its streets is to walk across what was once nothing more than bare, sun-scorched rock, a place so inhospitable that for centuries no one had seriously considered building anything permanent upon it. And yet within the span of only a few years following one of the most brutal sieges in Mediterranean history, a small and battle-weary religious military order transformed this barren promontory into a fortress city so formidable that it would go on to withstand every subsequent attempt to take it by force. And in this video, we will trace exactly how that transformation happened, moving from the desperate months of the Great Siege through the ambitious decisions that followed it, and into the extraordinary feat of engineering, labor, and stubborn determination that gave the world the city we now call Valletta. To understand why anyone would choose to build a city on such an unforgiving stretch of rock, it helps to first understand who the Knights of the Order of St. John actually were and how they came to find themselves defending a tiny cluster of islands in the middle of the Mediterranean, since this religious military order had been founded centuries earlier in the context of the Crusades. Originally established to care for pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land before gradually evolving into a formidable military force dedicated to defending Christian territory and combating the naval power of various Muslim states across the eastern Mediterranean. And after being driven first from the Holy Land and later from the island of Rhodes following a prolonged and costly siege, the Knights eventually found themselves granted the islands of Malta by the Holy Roman Emperor, a modest and largely barren territory that nonetheless offered a strategically vital position controlling the narrow channel of water separating Europe from North Africa. By the time the Knights had settled into their new home on Malta, they had already earned a reputation as one of the most persistent and troublesome adversaries facing the expanding power of the Ottoman Empire, whose fleets dominated much of the eastern Mediterranean and whose ambitions increasingly extended toward controlling the western basin of the sea as well. And this reputation, combined with Malta's strategic position along vital shipping and communication routes, made it almost inevitable that the Ottomans would eventually turn their full military attention toward dislodging the Knights from their new stronghold, setting the stage for a confrontation that would prove decisive not only for the order itself, but for the balance of power across the entire Mediterranean world. The order that arrived on Malta in 1530 brought with it a highly organized internal structure built around distinct national divisions known as longs, each representing knights drawn from a particular region of Catholic Europe, ranging from Provence and Auvergne to Italy, Aragon, Castile, England, and Germany. And this internal organization would eventually leave a lasting mark on the physical layout of Valletta itself, since each long maintained its own auberges within the city and often competed with the others to demonstrate its wealth and prestige through the scale and decoration of its buildings, a rivalry that added an additional layer of architectural ambition to a project already driven primarily by military necessity. Even before the confrontation of 1565, the Knights had spent decades reinforcing existing fortifications around the Grand Harbor, particularly the peninsula that would come to be known as Burgu, where an earlier fortress called Fort St. Angelo had served as the Order's primary stronghold since their arrival on the island. And while these earlier defenses would prove sufficient to survive the Great Siege, the experience of that conflict revealed with painful clarity just how close the existing arrangements had come to complete failure, planting the seeds of the far more ambitious project that would soon follow. That confrontation arrived in the spring of 1565, when an enormous Ottoman fleet appeared off the coast of Malta carrying a force that vastly outnumbered the defenders stationed on the island. And over the following months, what came to be known as the Great Siege of Malta unfolded as one of the most desperate and consequential military campaigns of the entire 16th century, pitting a relatively small garrison of knights and local Maltese fighters against a besieging army determined to seize control of the islands at almost any cost. And the fighting that followed proved extraordinarily brutal, concentrated particularly around the fortifications guarding the harbor, where wave after wave of assault tested the endurance and resolve of the defenders to their absolute limit. Despite suffering catastrophic losses and coming perilously close to complete defeat on several occasions, the defenders of Malta ultimately managed to hold their ground long enough for the arrival of a relief force from Sicily, which finally broke the siege and forced the exhausted Ottoman army to withdraw, and news of this unlikely victory spread rapidly across Christian Europe, transforming the Knights of St. John into celebrated heroes whose successful defense of Malta was widely credited, with halting further Ottoman expansion into the Western Mediterranean, a narrative that, while perhaps somewhat simplified in retrospect, nonetheless captured the imagination of contemporaries and brought the order both renewed prestige and a flood of financial support from grateful monarchs and religious institutions across the continent. The human cost of those months proved staggering by any measure, with the order losing a substantial portion of its fighting knights and the local Maltese population enduring casualties, displacement, and destruction across large sections of the island. And the physical toll on the existing fortifications was equally severe, with sections of walls reduced to rubble and entire bastions rendered barely defensible by the time the Ottoman fleet finally withdrew, leaving behind a landscape of devastation that made the vulnerability of the order's existing defensive arrangements impossible to ignore. News of the successful defense reached Rome and other European capitals within weeks, prompting an outpouring of congratulatory messages, financial pledges, and offers of skilled personnel from rulers and religious institutions eager to be associated with what was widely regarded as a providential victory over a seemingly unstoppable Ottoman advance. And this wave of goodwill would prove essential in the months that followed, since the order's own resources, severely depleted by the prolonged fighting, would have been entirely insufficient to fund the ambitious construction project that its leadership was already beginning to contemplate. In the immediate aftermath of the siege, the order's leadership recognized with unusual clarity that the existing fortifications, though they had ultimately held, had come dangerously close to failing, and that any future attack, likely to be even better prepared given the lessons the Ottomans themselves would draw from their defeat, could not be safely met using the same defensive arrangements that had barely proven sufficient the first time around. And this recognition led directly to one of the most consequential decisions in the order's entire history, namely the choice to abandon reliance on the existing fortified towns and instead construct an entirely new city from scratch, purpose-built from its very foundations to withstand the most advanced siege techniques and artillery that contemporary military engineering could bring to bear. The site chosen for this new city was a narrow peninsula of solid limestone known as Mount Sybaris, a promontory that separated the two great natural harbors on Malta's eastern coast and that had, during the recent siege, served as a key position from which Ottoman forces had been able to bombard the order's existing fortifications, meaning that whoever controlled this rocky spine of land effectively controlled access to both harbors simultaneously. And this strategic reality made the decision to fortify Mount Sybaris almost self-evident, even though the site itself presented enormous practical challenges, consisting largely of exposed bedrock with barely any natural soil, no reliable source of fresh water, and virtually no existing infrastructure of any kind to support construction on the scale being contemplated. Securing the resources and expertise necessary for such an ambitious undertaking required the order to look well beyond its own limited means, and the Grand Master overseeing the project successfully appealed to the Pope for both financial support and access to some of the finest military engineers available anywhere in Europe, a request that resulted in the arrival of Francesco Laparelli, an accomplished Italian architect and engineer who had previously worked on fortification projects in Rome, and who brought with him the most current thinking in the rapidly evolving field of military architecture, a discipline that had been transformed in recent decades by the growing power of gunpowder artillery and the corresponding need for entirely new approaches to defensive design. Laparelli's arrival on Malta in the closing months of 1565 marked the beginning of an intense and remarkably compressed planning process, during which he worked to translate the strategic requirements of the site into a coherent architectural vision, drawing on the star-shaped fortification principles that had become increasingly standard across European military engineering, an approach that replaced the tall, vulnerable medieval walls of earlier centuries with lower, angled bastions, specifically designed to eliminate blind spots and allow defenders to direct overlapping fields of fire against any attacking force attempting to approach the walls, a system that represented a fundamental rethinking of how cities could be made to withstand the destructive power of modern artillery. This new approach to fortification, often referred to by later historians as the Tres Italienne, had emerged gradually across Italian city-states over the preceding decades in direct response to the growing effectiveness of siege artillery, which had rendered the tall, thin walls of medieval fortifications increasingly obsolete, since such walls could be battered down relatively quickly by determined cannon fire. And the solution developed by Italian engineers involved constructing much lower and thicker walls backed by substantial earthen ramparts capable of absorbing artillery bombardment, combined with angular bastions projecting outward at regular intervals to ensure that every section of wall remained within range of defensive fire from a neighboring position. Laparelli's task in adapting these general principles to the specific conditions of Mount Sibera's required careful surveying of the site's irregular topography, since the peninsula's uneven rock formations and steep natural slopes toward the surrounding harbors meant that the fortification plan could not simply follow an idealized geometric template, but instead needed to respond to the particular contours of the terrain, incorporating natural cliff faces as additional defensive advantages in certain sections while requiring extensive artificial reinforcement in others where the natural landscape offered less inherent protection. Working alongside Laparelli was a Maltese architect named Girolamo Cassar, who would go on to play an increasingly central role in the project as construction progressed, eventually assuming primary responsibility for translating the overall fortification plan into the detailed architecture of the city's streets, public buildings, and residential quarters. And this collaboration between an internationally trained military engineer and a locally rooted architect proved essential to the project's ultimate success, combining sophisticated European engineering principles with a practical understanding of local building materials, labor conditions, and the specific challenges posed by Malta's distinctive limestone bedrock. The foundation ceremony for the new city took place in the spring of 1566, less than a year after the siege had ended, an extraordinarily rapid timeline that reflected both the urgency felt by the order's leadership and the very real possibility that another Ottoman attack could arrive at almost any moment. And from this ceremonial beginning, an enormous workforce was mobilized to begin the process of quite literally carving a city out of solid rock, a task that required cutting through the exposed limestone of Mount Sibera's to create level building surfaces, excavating deep ditches around the perimeter fortifications, and simultaneously constructing an extensive network of underground cisterns designed to capture and store the rainwater that would otherwise have made permanent habitation on this barren promontory essentially impossible. The sheer scale of labor required for this undertaking is difficult to overstate, since virtually every element of the city, from the deep defensive ditches surrounding the fortifications to the level terraces on which buildings would eventually stand, had to be created by manually cutting through solid rock using little more than iron tools and sustained human effort, a process that consumed the labor of thousands of workers over a period of years, and that left the distinctive marks of this quarrying process visible in the city's foundations even today, where careful observation reveals the tool marks left behind by the laborers who transformed bare stone into a habitable urban landscape. Organizing and sustaining a workforce of this size on a small island with limited existing infrastructure presented enormous logistical challenges in its own right, requiring the order to coordinate the supply of food, tools, and temporary housing for thousands of laborers drawn not only from the local Maltese population, but also from Sicily and other nearby territories, and maintaining consistent progress across multiple simultaneous construction sites demanded a level of administrative coordination that stretched the order's existing bureaucratic capacity considerably beyond anything it had previously attempted. Disease and harsh working conditions took a steady toll on the laborers throughout the construction process, with outbreaks of illness periodically disrupting work schedules and claiming the lives of workers already weakened by the physical demands of quarrying and construction under the intense heat of the Maltese summer. And while detailed records of these losses have not survived in complete form, Surviving correspondence from the period makes clear that maintaining an adequate and healthy workforce remained a persistent concern for those overseeing the project throughout its most intensive early years. Financing this massive undertaking required the order to draw on every available source of income, including contributions solicited from wealthy patrons across Catholic Europe, revenue generated from the order's own extensive landholdings scattered throughout the continent, and funds raised through various forms of taxation imposed on the local Maltese population. And despite this diversified approach to financing, the project repeatedly faced budget shortfalls and delays, forcing Laparelli and later Cassar to make difficult decisions about which elements of the original ambitious design could realistically be completed within the constraints of available time and money. Progress on the project was further complicated by the death of Laparelli in 1570, only a few years after construction had begun, leaving Cassar to assume full responsibility for guiding the city's continued development, a transition that required considerable adaptation since Cassar now needed to balance fidelity to the original fortification plan against the practical realities of an ongoing construction project facing constant pressure to demonstrate visible progress. And under his continued direction, the city gradually took shape according to a grid pattern of streets that represented a striking departure from the winding, organic layouts characteristic of most medieval Mediterranean towns. Cassar's own background as a Maltese architect who had trained under Laparelli during the early planning stages positioned him uniquely well to complete the project, since he combined a thorough understanding of the sophisticated fortification principles introduced by his predecessor with an intimate familiarity with local building traditions, materials, and labor practices that had been refined over generations of construction using Malta's distinctive Globigerina limestone, a relatively soft stone that could be cut with considerable precision while still fresh from the quarry before gradually hardening upon prolonged exposure to air. Under Cassar's continued leadership, difficult decisions had to be made regarding which elements of the original ambitious vision could realistically be completed given the persistent financial constraints facing the order, and several of the more elaborate architectural flourishes originally proposed by Laparelli were ultimately simplified or abandoned altogether in favor of a more restrained and economical approach that nonetheless preserved the essential defensive integrity of the overall fortification system, a pragmatic compromise that allowed construction to proceed steadily even as available funding fluctuated considerably from year to year. This grid pattern, imposed with remarkable consistency across the uneven terrain of Mount Sybaris, reflected contemporary Renaissance ideals about rational urban planning, prioritizing straight thoroughfares that would allow both efficient troop movement during any future siege and improved circulation of air through the densely built urban environment. Though the underlying topography of the peninsula meant that many of these straight streets were forced to climb steeply from the harbor edges toward the higher ground at the center of the city, creating a distinctive urban experience defined by long straight stairways and dramatically sloping roads that continue to characterize movement through Valletta even in the present day. Beyond the street grid itself, the defensive architecture surrounding the new city represented the most technically sophisticated fortification system that had yet been attempted anywhere in the Mediterranean world, incorporating multiple concentric layers of bastions, revelants, and counterguards specifically arranged to ensure that any attacking force would be forced to expose itself to devastating crossfire from several directions simultaneously before ever reaching the main walls, a design philosophy that treated the entire fortification system as an integrated whole rather than a simple perimeter wall, with each individual element calculated to support and reinforce the defensive capacity of its neighbors. The construction of these fortifications required an unprecedented degree of precision in cutting and shaping the local limestone, since the effectiveness of the star-shaped bastion system depended entirely on achieving exact angles and dimensions capable of eliminating any blind spots that an attacking force might otherwise exploit. And achieving this level of precision using the tools and techniques available in the late 16th century represented a remarkable technical accomplishment in its own right, requiring skilled stonemasons to work according to detailed mathematical specifications rather than the more intuitive building traditions that had guided earlier fortification projects. Alongside the military fortifications, the new city also incorporated a range of civic and religious buildings intended to establish Valletta as a genuine urban center rather than merely a military installation, including the construction of a grand conventual church intended to serve as the spiritual heart of the order, along with residences known as auberges built to house knights according to the various linguistic and national groupings, or longs, into which the order's membership was traditionally divided, each auberge reflecting the particular architectural tastes and resources of the national group it served while still conforming to the overall urban plan established by Cassar. The construction of the conventual church, which would eventually become known as St. John's Co-Cathedral, proceeded according to a design that deliberately presented a relatively austere exterior facade, a choice that reflected both budgetary constraints and a broader defensive logic prioritizing military function over decorative display. Though this restrained exterior would later stand in striking contrast to the extraordinarily elaborate interior decoration added to the building in subsequent decades, once the immediate pressures of construction and defense had eased sufficiently to allow greater attention toward artistic embellishment. Providing an adequate supply of fresh water for the growing city presented one of the most persistent engineering challenges throughout the construction process, since Mount Siberias contained no natural springs or reliable water sources of its own, requiring the order's engineers to develop an extensive system of cisterns carved directly into the bedrock beneath individual buildings, designed to capture and store rainwater collected from rooftops and street surfaces throughout the wetter winter months, a system that would later be supplemented by an aqueduct bringing additional water from springs located elsewhere on the island, though this aqueduct project would not reach completion until several decades after the city's initial construction phase had concluded. This reliance on individual cisterns beneath nearly every building created a hidden underground landscape running beneath the entire city, an interconnected network of storage chambers that would later prove unexpectedly valuable during subsequent conflicts, offering both a reliable water supply and additional storage space that could be adapted for other purposes whenever circumstances demanded. And the sheer extent of this underground infrastructure, largely invisible from street level, represents one of the more remarkable but frequently overlooked engineering achievements woven into the fabric of the city. As construction progressed through the 1570s, the city gradually began attracting permanent residents beyond the knights and their immediate household staff, including merchants, craftsmen, and laborers drawn by the economic opportunities created by such a massive and sustained building project. And this growing civilian population required its own infrastructure of markets, workshops, and residential housing, all of which needed to be accommodated within the same rigid grid plan originally. Conceived primarily around military and ceremonial considerations, a tension between defensive rigor and civilian practicality that would continue to shape the city's development for generations to come. Daily life within this newly forming urban environment took shape gradually, with narrow side streets branching off the main thoroughfares filling with small workshops producing everything from clothing and tools to the specialized equipment required by the order's naval galleys. And markets established near the harbor edges grew to serve both the immediate needs of the construction workforce and the broader commercial traffic passing through Malta's strategically positioned ports, gradually transforming what had begun as a purely military construction site into a genuinely functioning urban economy. By the time the most essential elements of the city's defensive and civic infrastructure had reached completion, roughly a decade after construction had first begun, Valletta had already established itself as the new capital of the order and, by extension, of Malta itself, a remarkable achievement considering that the entire site had consisted of nothing more than bare rock only a few years earlier. And this rapid transformation from empty promontory to fortified capital city stood as a powerful testament to both the technical sophistication of contemporary military engineering and the sheer determination of an organization still recovering from one of the most punishing sieges in its long history. The defensive effectiveness of Valletta's fortifications would eventually be tested in later centuries, though never again through the kind of prolonged Ottoman siege that had originally prompted its construction. and instead the city's formidable walls would go on to play a significant role during later conflicts affecting Malta, including periods of French occupation and eventually the sustained aerial bombardment endured during the Second World War, when the underlying strength of the original fortifications, combined with the extensive network of underground tunnels and shelters carved into the same limestone bedrock, helped the city and its population survive one of the most intense sustained bombing campaigns experienced by any urban center during that entire conflict. Looking back across the full span of Valletta's history, from its origins as an emergency response to near catastrophic defeat, through its eventual recognition as one of the finest surviving examples of Renaissance military architecture anywhere in the world, it becomes clear that the city represents far more than simply an impressive collection of fortifications, standing instead as a lasting monument to the capacity of determined human effort to reshape even the most unpromising physical environment into something capable of enduring for centuries. And today, walking along the same straight streets originally laid out by Cassar and gazing across the same harbors once defended by Laparelli's carefully calculated bastions, visitors continue to encounter a city that still bears the unmistakable imprint of the crisis that brought it into being and the extraordinary determination that saw it through to completion. In recognition of this remarkable architectural and historical legacy, the entire city of Valletta was eventually designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site, a status reflecting international acknowledgement of the exceptional and largely unaltered character of its Renaissance fortifications, its dense concentration of historic buildings within an extraordinarily compact urban footprint, and the enduring influence its innovative defensive design exerted on subsequent generations of European military engineers who studied and adapted the principles first realized on this small Mediterranean promontory. The lasting influence of Valletta's design also extended well beyond its own defensive purposes, since the techniques and principles developed and refined during its construction went on to inform fortification projects across Europe and its colonial territories in the decades that followed, making this small city, built in desperate haste on bare rock in response to an existential military threat, an unexpected but genuinely significant contributor to the broader evolution of military architecture across the early modern world. If this story of siege, survival, and reconstruction resonates with you, share your own thoughts in the comments about which aspect of Valletta's construction you find most remarkable, whether the sheer speed with which the city was built, the technical sophistication of its fortifications, or the sheer physical effort required to carve an entire urban landscape directly out of solid rock. And in an upcoming video, we will turn our attention to the broader legacy of the Knights of St. John across the Mediterranean world, tracing how an organization forged in the context of medieval pilgrimage ultimately left behind one of the most remarkable fortified cities anywhere on Earth.